Sup guys, Bjorn here. For today's video we're gonna do a tier list for 9.1 Sanctum of Domination. I'm doing it from a mythic perspective and we're just gonna take a look at the DPS classes to see where I think they're gonna stack up. This is obviously no known information, right? I'm just speculating here. I have no idea where it's actually gonna end up, but considering the meta in Nathria, right? Considering what the top guilds are doing, considering raid testing, there's obviously a lot of room to speculate. There's a ton of stuff to go on, and I feel like most people who know stuff about mythic raiding and about the new raid and about the current meta is probably going to be able to guess fairly accurately what classes are going to be run in the next year. So I figured it'd be really fun to get this done as well. I saw Dratnos did one of these, for example, and I really enjoyed it, but I feel like something that's missing in some of these videos is just like more context from the actual raid, right? It's gonna depend so much on the raid and on the encounters itself, what classes are gonna be run, that I feel like it could be pretty nice to just go through some of the bosses in the raid and see how the different DPS specs stack up against them. So that's my little spin on this. We're gonna go a little bit more in depth here, and yeah, hope you enjoy it. So the first thing I was gonna touch on is just like the general philosophy of the ranking, right? In mythic raiding, usually there's only a couple of bosses at the end there that's actually a challenge for like the top guilds, for the guilds that are actually running world first, right? Which is ultimately what this meta prediction is gonna be about, right? The meta is defined by the world first guilds. It's always been that way. It will always be that way, no matter how important it really is for the lower end of the player base. But regardless, and for the first race world first guilds, well, it's only a couple of bosses that actually matters. And it's interesting because in this raid I'm actually very uncertain about how many of these bosses are going to be difficult. In Castle Nathria it was pretty straightforward that maybe Sludge Fist or even Council would be the step up. Now Council was the step up, but Limit still cleared in like 10 pulls or some shit like that, which is very impressive, right? But they also did have a very good strat for it. In terms of Sanctum of Domination, I think the wall could be anywhere from Kel'Thuzad to Painsmith here. I think it's possible that Painsmith is the wall because he's really hard mechanically, and it's some like new spin on Mythic maybe. I still feel that most of the good Mythic guilds are gonna clear Painsmith in like no more than maybe 30 pulls, let's say that. Then we have Guardians of the First Ones. This is who people think is gonna be the first wall, right? Because it's a single target pump fight, it's a patchwork fight, it's similar to Sludge Fist. It's basically just gonna depend on numbers tuning, and Fate Scribe Rocalo is also a pretty interesting fight. It has a lot of mechanics. It could very well be a wall, considering how much AoE there is, considering how many mechanics there are. The fight looks long, it looks intensive, and you might even have to bring some single target here. I'm not quite sure how important single target is going to be on this fight, but yeah. Same goes for Kel'Thuzad. I'm not sure how important single target is going to be, but Kel'Thuzad is for sure going to be a difficult boss, I think, on Mythic. And if none of these guys prove to be the wall, I think Kel'Thuzad is going to be the wall. It has some light movement, and the AoE, there's a ton of AoE, but might be more towards the ranged side here, because the ads are very spread out, right? Might be something like Balanced Druid, or even some other range specs might be really good here. And then we have Sylvanas at the end. Single target is obviously going to be very important for Sylvanas. It always is on a last boss on Mythic. The movement I'm not quite sure about. There's some movement in P2, there's some movement in P1, but not really that much. I think the movement is more likely to be light than heavy here. But one thing that we could consider is how well people deal with phase 3. If there's movement in phase 3 as well, then suddenly you might see more movement intense classes being brought here. There's some AoE in P2, but I'm not sure how relevant that is for actually killing the fight, right? And also, I saw some speculation about Sylvanas being targetable in phase 2, right? You're supposed to burn Sylvanas in phase 2 as well as the ads, and in that case, it might be pretty important to have some range players, because I'm not sure if the melee can actually do damage to Sylvanas even in P2. So this is pretty interesting. I also saw some speculation on melee being shit in Sylvanas P1 or stuff like that. I think that's completely false. Melee is going to be fine in P1, and Sylvanas P1, let's be real, it's not going to be a big deal in general. So let's stop hating on the melee players, but there is some concern here still. I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out. So, well, let's just get straight into the DPS specs then, shall we? Now, Mage is an interesting one, because Fire did get quite nerfed. That said, Mage is always going to be super strong, right? Because you need the Arcane Intellect, you're always going to bring at least one Mage, and both Frost and Arcane looks pretty strong. It has some decent damage. So I would say Mages, don't be too scared here, but I think Fire has fallen off quite a bit. And this is an interesting one, because now Fire has often fallen off in the past as well, and often been the inferior Mage spec in many ways, at least pure DPS wise, but due to the fact that Combustion is so goddamn broken, right, and you have Execute with Scorch, you're just a really valuable progression spec in general. Like, you can push specific burst timings, you can push ads, you can push the boss, you can just do a lot of stuff that other classes can't. So it's very possible that the Fire Mage is still gonna end up quite high here, even though from pure DPS perspective, I'll probably put it in C tier. Considering how good Mages are though, I'm gonna have to bump it up to B tier. So that's where Fire lies. Now, Frost and Arcane, I think, are gonna be better than Fire. They have more damage, they have like, Frost actually has some good damage profile as well, and Arcane is a singular pumper. I think these guys are gonna be pretty strong, both of them, depending on what fight you're looking at here. And especially on like Fate, Scribe, Kel'Thuzad, and Sylvanas, I feel like Frost is gonna be pretty good. So get excited for that. Now, coming over to Enhancement Shaman, I've actually forgot to place Elemental here as well. I think Enhancement is an interesting one because it doesn't bring any raid buffs. It really does nothing for the raid in general, and it's a melee spec, so you're probably not going to see a lot of Enhancement Shamans, obviously, especially not at the top end. But that's just the nature of the beast, right? We're never going to see Enhancement Shamans unless they're like, they get a raid buff or they're just doing tons of damage. So Enhancement probably not going to be the best. I would still rate it over some of the other niche melee specs here, because it does have some decent damage potential in my opinion, and it's semi-ranged, it has some off healing, you know, it does have some stuff going for it. Elemental, I would still say it fits in the A tier here. It does have some good single target damage, it has good consistent AoE, it has some decent AoE burst. It's just generally a pretty good caster. The only problem with Elemental right now, it doesn't really have those numbers, those single target numbers that some of the other classes have, but I would still say they're pretty strong. A good overall progression class. Shadow Priest. Now, Shadow Priest is gonna have to go into the S tier, boys. Let's be real. They have a massive single target, which is always gonna be important on progression, right? There's no way, like, at least 4 or 3 of these bosses are gonna require some heavy single target. Sylvanas and Kel'Thuzad both are gonna require single target. Guardian is gonna require heavy single target probably, if the tuning is right. So Shadow Priest, very strong in those fights. And then on top of that, their AoE is not even bad, right? Their AoE is fucking good, and their burst AoE is good. They have good CDs. They scale very good with everything basically. So I feel like Shadow Priest, it's only gonna get better the further the tier goes. How many Shadow Priests are being brought though is a different question, right? Because although they do really good single targets, sometimes some fights just need a lot of specific classes that you can't really just bring the best single target pumper, right? So depending on what is going to be hard here, if the AoE part of Fate Scribe is going to be the hard part, if the AoE part of Kel'Thuzad is going to be the hard part, right? If Guardian is tuned very low, so you don't really need that many single target pumpers, then you might just end up seeing like 1 Shadow Priest. Although I think we're going to end up seeing probably 2 Shadow Priests in Mythic progression regals at the start of the tier, or even more. So Shadow Priest, real strong. Then apparently I have forgot to group Feral and Balance as well, but Feral, kind of similar to Enhance, right? It does do more single target than Enhance, but at the end of the day, I don't feel like this tier is going to be super important for single target actually, and Feral still suffers a lot of the same issues as these other melee specs, right? It doesn't have a raid buff, it doesn't bring anything, it's probably even worse than Enhanced to bring Feral, so I don't know. I feel like Feral is not looking too hot, boys, even though the DPS is decent. Balanced Druid on the other hand, this is where your Druid specs lies, boys. Balance is gonna be very strong, I think, because even though the single target's not as high as the Shadow Priest here, Ventir, I've heard rumors of some Ventir Balanced Druid memes, and if Kel'Thuzad is gonna be difficult, Balanced Druid is gonna be amazing on those AoE cleave phases, right, in Kel'Thuzad. Same goes for Faith Scribe. I think Balanced Druid has the potential to be amazing in Faith Scribe if that ends up being a tough fight. And even in Sylvanas, I mean, P2 Balanced Druid is good. They have good movement, they have good single target, they are very tanky. You know, there's not a lot of stuff going poorly for the Balanced Druid here. The only way I would see Balanced Druid not being played much is if maybe Guardian of the first ones is really the first wall, right? This is the first wall. Then maybe Fate Scribe isn't that hard, or maybe the DPS part of Fate Scribe isn't that hard. Maybe Kel'Thuzad is just a joke in terms of the AoE. Maybe you just need some single target there. In that case, then maybe balance falls off a little bit. But if the AoE part on these two fights is going to be just slightly relevant, right, then I think balance is going to be an S tier spec, and you're probably going to run anything from 1 to 3 Balanced Druids on progression. So in terms of the S tier specs, these are the two real pumpers so far. I feel like Fury and Arms is actually rising in 9.1. I think they're going to be quite strong. They do have some decent AoE damage, some decent single target damage. They're probably going to be good on Sylvanas. You're going to be bring at least one warrior, right, for the shout. Now you probably won't be bringing more than one warrior for the shout, obviously. The question is, would you bring in a protection warrior or one of these guys? And I feel like it's pretty straightforward that you would be bringing one of Fury and Arms, I feel like, instead of a protection warrior this tier. So I would end up putting in at the top of B tier. Maybe they even deserve to be at the bottom of A tier, but I don't think there's going to be more than one of these ran. And I still think they're going to end up being worse than some other melee specs, right? So I'm going to keep them in the top of B tier for now. As for the DKs, it's also pretty interesting, right? Because DKs, they're going to follow from Nathria while the warriors are rising. And in terms of deciding which melee spec is going to be better, DPS Death Knight or DPS Warrior, it's so tough for me to decide that, man. I don't play a lot of neither of these classes, and I might be biased because my DK players are always pumping, but I still think DK is going to be slightly better than Warrior. Slightly better than Warrior, because they do have the grip. They do have the AMC still, even though it's nerfed. They're a good progression spec. They have movement cancels. And I feel like Warrior, while it brings a buff, obviously, it still doesn't quite bring enough damage for you to bring it over some of these other specs we're going to talk about later. For example, Havoc. I think Havoc has more potential than Warrior for sure, and it does pretty much the exact same thing, right? So that's why I have Warrior down here. Might end up being a little bit stronger than what I predict here, but it's hard to say, right? Then we're entering a little bit of a more niche territory here. I'm a little bit biased here, guys, I'm not gonna lie. I do main Windwalker, and it hurts me to say this, but Windwalker single target is very, very bad right now. It's probably one of the lowest in the game, if not the lowest after Survival Hunter, right? And yeah, not looking too hot in that area. So if this is a wall, and if the single target ends up being important on all of these three, which it might very well be, like the single target is very likely to be important on all of these three, then Windwalker might actually fall off quite a bit, because their single target is just so bad, right? But on the other hand, if the AoE part of Fate Scribe is going to be very important, if the AoE part of Kel'Thuzad is going to be important, if Sylvanas P2 is going to be important, Then suddenly I think Windwalker rises a lot because they do have amazing burst AoE. They can just like single-handedly deal with most burst AoE situations, right? They probably have best burst AoE in the game right now, up there with Elemental Shaman. So it really does depend on how, like, what parts of these fights are gonna be difficult. But overall, I would still have to place it a little bit lower than the DK, sadly, because it does do really subpar single targets, sadly. But it does have tons of mobility, it's really tanky, it's always going to be a good progression spec as long as it does have somewhere to shine, right? So I'm just hoping for these AoE parts of these fights to be good in order to for Windwalker to shine a little bit. Ret is very similar to Windwalker here, I think. It does have really good burst AoE, but their single target is a lot better than Windwalker. Still though, they don't really have a raid buff, they don't really have any compelling reason to bring them other than their damage. So they're always going to be a little bit lower. But I feel like Ret is going to be pretty decent in this tier, actually, compared to what it might be sometimes. Assas is pretty much the only good rogue spec, I feel like. It does have good single target again, but now we run into the problems of, ooh, like, do we want to bring a rogue? Probably not, right? Rogue has no raid utility, has no raid buff or anything like that, and single target might end up being decent on some of these fights here, but at the end of the day, I feel like Assas is probably going to end up contributing a lot less than even Warrior, Ret, and maybe even Unholy, right? So I feel like it does maybe drop down a little bit here. And then we have Outlaw and Sub, which are just like straight up worse than Assas pretty much every time. They don't have good single target. They do maybe have some good AoE in terms of, or cleave in terms of Outlaw, but I don't think their like Outlaw cleave is nowhere near as good as Windwalker Ret anyway, so there's no reason to run an Outlaw rogue really. And I mean, if you're gonna run a rogue, you're probably gonna run an Assas rogue. Survival is pretty much in the same spot here. It's just really poor single target. Hunters are not looking too good in general, right? And I mean, Survival just doesn't bring anything again. And yeah, it's just a meme spec. I don't think people are going to play Survival still, even though it does. I have seen it seeming higher than the other Hunter specs, but I don't think that you're going to run it over Marksman still. Marksman, even though it's bad, and it doesn't have the greatest DPS, it still has some really good powerful 2-minute CDs, it has decent single target in those CDs, and it has decent burst AoE in those CDs. It's kind of similar to a budget Windwalker, but it's also ranged, right? So it does have some advantages there over Windwalker, although their single target's also higher than Windwalker. So yeah, Marksmanship I feel like might end up in a bit of a similar spot to Windwalker, that oh shit. You might run it, but yeah, it doesn't look the strongest right now. Then we have Havoc DH. This is an interesting one, right? Because Havoc DH actually has some pretty good single target in 9.1. It has some pretty good AoE in 9.1. It's basically almost as mobile as the Windwalker. It's not very squishy, and it also has Darkness, which is probably going to rise a bit in priority since AMC is worse. So I feel like Havoc is actually going to be the best melee spec for 9.1 in my opinion. I think it will bring a lot of good stuff on all these fights, right? Because if the AoE part of Fate Scribe and Kill to Stun is going to be important, well, then guess what? Havoc is actually going to pump on those parts, right? They're probably going to pump as hard as the Windwalker almost. And then, if the Guardian of the First Ones or Sylvanas single target or even Kel'Thuzad single targets ends up being really important, well then, they're still going to be the best melee spec, right? So, yeah. I feel like Havoc is going to rise in priority a lot. It does have that 5% magic damage debuff as well, in which case, like, if you don't run a Vengeance, you're going to need one of these. And I feel like some people are probably going to swap out their Vengeance Demon Hunters. I don't think it's looking as strong in my one. So, I think Havoc's probably going to be the most frequent melee spec run. Even though I think DKs, you obviously are going to still have one DK, right? So, maybe we should bump up an old. So last and definitely least, we have the Warlocks. Now, I've been playing some Demo recently, I've been enjoying it a lot, so I might be slightly biased here, but I feel like this is gonna be one of the better Demo tiers in a long time. Probably since Eternal Palace, right? Or BUD was it maybe? Yeah, it was probably BUD. But this time, there's no gimmicks. I just think Demo is like pretty good in terms of single target. It's really good. It's probably top 2 or top 3, just pure single target DPS in 9.1. It still suffers from some like AoE problems, right? It doesn't do great burst AoE. It doesn't do consistent AoE. It doesn't do like on-demand single target either. If you don't have the Tyrant, obviously, you need a lot of setup. There's a lot of cruxes here with the Demolock, but it's still the best Warlock spec for single target, and I think it's gonna be played on Guardian, for sure. It might be played on Sylvanas, probably not. It's gonna be played on like Terragru single target fights, basically. In terms of the other fights here, I don't think you're gonna play Demo probably, but still holds its own. If you're a Demo 1 trick, I think this is gonna be your best tier in a long while, right? You're actually gonna be up there competing with like every single spec on just damage on every single fight if you want to. If you get a spec right, you have the potential this time around. That said, it does obviously still have some Demo limitations, stuff like that, so I'm gonna have to end up putting it in the B tier still. But if you're a Warlock, I would suggest picking up Demo now, start practicing it so you can swap it out for Guardian and do some insane single targets, right? Warlock, similar to Fire Mage, it's been pretty gutted. Now, the problem with Warlock is, like, Fire Mage might even be brought, right? Because they still have this amazing profile with combustion and scorch and stuff that's usually pretty important on the progression. So even though Fire is worse DPS wise than Arcane and Frost, it might still be brought on progression. Now, I don't think the same is true for Warlock. I think Warlocks, just their damage right now and their profile is not good enough to be brought ever over Destro and Demo. I just feel like Warlock is pretty much dead. I don't think it's going to be played on any fights. Destro, on the other hand, is the best Warlock spec. It's slightly behind Demo in single target, but it does edge out in like 2 target, 3 target, basically everything else, obviously, because Demo has bad AoE. In terms of actually placing it, it does belong in the A tier. It does have some really good windows on a lot of the fights, in my opinion. It's amazing on Rasnal. You have some Havoc windows there, some stuff. On Fate Scribe, you're probably going to be able to get up some big Cataclysms and even some 2-target Havoc windows. Kel'Thuzad might be slightly worse, but even then I feel like Kata and stuff is going to make Destro way better than Demo, at least, I think, if the single target part of Kel'Thuzad is not impressively important. And then we have Sylvanas, which I think you're still also going to end up playing Destro over Demo. And Warlocks are broken, right? They have health stones, they're tanky, you're always going to bring at least one. All of this means that I think Destro does belong in the A tier this tier. And I would probably bring it over an LA Shaman at this point as well, just for damage profile. So, yeah. There we have the whole tier list, guys. Looking at it now, I feel pretty happy with it. I'm slightly worried about the Warrior here. Maybe I should have bumped that up a little bit. Yeah, that was the tier list, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, this is pure speculation. If you have any thoughts, anything you thought I was trolling about, maybe your main spec is on the D tier here, or maybe you just think I'm trolling with the Warriors, maybe I should have placed them a lot higher, maybe the DKs are a little bit low too. I don't know what you guys think, but hit me up in the comments if you have any questions, if you have any ideas, and yeah, like the video if you liked it. See you in the next one.